Tying that back to Austrian economics, one thing that Hayek really stressed the importance of was the denationalization of money. He saw that really a thing that has caused so much havoc and harm in people's lives is nationalized money, right? Like governments having total control of money and money coming from government and not, people being able to choose what money they want. And that's what Bitcoin powerfully it gives people that choice. And it does so because it's censorship resistant, right? If governments could shut Bitcoin down, they would have done it 10 years ago, right? But they can't. So it gives people this kind of roundabout way, is the way Hayek posed it. He said, we won't ever really fix this until we create something that he basically said, we can't take the power of the control of our money back from governments. We have to just kind of create something else.
Is Bitcoin dead? David Waugh, managing editor at AIER, doesn't think so. In this episode of Liberty Curious, we discuss the philosophy and intrinsic value of Bitcoin, the problems and politicization of centralized finance, the reasons Bitcoin may have been created, and what the future might look like. If you enjoy this podcast, you can also check out the Liberty Curious playlist on AIER here. You can subscribe to this new channel and hit the notification bell to be notified of all new videos.
Oh yeah, that's great. I could talk about this for hours, so.
That's great. Well, most Bitcoiners can, right? There's something about it that gets people excited. And maybe that's a good place to start. So thank you, David, for being here today. And tell me, why is Bitcoin so exciting for people? Why is it exciting for you to talk about?
Yeah, so I think that Bitcoin is so exciting because really we haven't had a new form of money in a really long time, right? I think that, people had gold, and then they had, dollars that were backed by gold, and then they weren't. Right. And then, you have credit cards, but those are really, you're spending dollars on credit cards. Right. So we haven't had a new form of money. There's many reasons that have prevented kind of new forms of money, monetary technology from really coming about. But, it's really exciting for that reason. And then also for all of the benefits that Bitcoin might offer to people that use it.
So now there's also been a lot of bad headlines about Bitcoin and crypto in general, right? So the last, I guess, maybe starting with the beginning of the COVID crisis and the authoritarianism that started to rise and, excess government control and regulation and restrictions and things like that, you saw that there was kind of this movement of a lot of people who were going towards Bitcoin as a way to kind of have some insurance, I guess, against fiat currency and the fact that it might go awry. And now those things are actually happening. We're seeing talks about CBDCs, and we're seeing things like, the truckers' convoy protest in Canada, where the banks came and crushed any dissent by freezing people's bank accounts. So there was definitely value in going towards something like Bitcoin. But then we've also seen it go from, I think the all-time high was 69,000, now down, sitting somewhere around 20,000. So people are kind of saying, hey, well, we warned you, we told you, right? So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I have a lot to say about that, right? So, one of the things that makes Bitcoin so powerful as one of its main, I guess, features is that it allows people to transact without asking, a third party for permission. Right? You can do permissionless transactions on the Bitcoin network. I can send money to a relative in South America without, waiting a few days for the wire transfer to get approved, right? And that's a really powerful tool with respect to financial privacy and just, the ability to transfer value across space and time, instantly. And so that kind of idea, Bitcoin being a digital cash where you don't have to ask permission from your bank to send money to somebody else. Those are really powerful applications of Bitcoin. And when you're thinking about people who want to dissent from their government, right? It's powerful. And that was one of the things that kind of inspired the main thing that inspired the creation of Bitcoin is the quest for digital cash, right? Like the cypherpunks, the kind of group of computer scientists, economists, technologists, this group of people in the 1980s and 1990s that were working on, creating a digital cash. They were concerned with you had for 50 years you had dollars. People could or whatever currencies were in your country, where you could walk down to the store, buy something with a paper fiat currency, give it to your relatives, right? But then when centralized finance became digital, that allows the centralized institutions to cancel, censor your transactions really easily, right? And so the kind of cypherpunks were realizing, wait, if we want to have privacy in a digital world, we need digital cash. So they really, Bitcoin was the fruition of, 10 or 20 years of hard work by that group. And then they kind of just released it into the world for everybody's benefit. And so when you're thinking about, a protest movement, whether it's in Canada or Vietnam or Nigeria, right, that ability to, fund yourself, accept donations, send money to your fellow people in the movement, right, but without the ability of the government or another centralized institution to censor you, that's really powerful.
Right. I remember seeing a few years back as well, places like Venezuela who were experiencing hyperinflation. They were using Bitcoin because it was allowing them, I guess, to have more economic freedom and to make transactions that were more just somehow. But it's also kind of difficult to fathom because you look at the price of Bitcoin, which fluctuates quite a lot compared to a fiat currency. So, what would you say to that kind of thing?
Yeah, and before I get into that, there's one other thing that I missed about Bitcoin, and that's that anybody can use it, right? That's really powerful as well. Just the fact that anybody with internet access can use this monetary network to transfer value across space and time to whoever they want, right? Like that's huge because, if you're in Venezuela, you don't have access to other, monetary networks that are, they might be provided by the government, whatever. But with Bitcoin, all you need is internet. And then with respect to price action, the fact that the fact that it's volatile is, it does make it challenging for people who are using it. And the price is really impacted by so many things, just like the price of gold is impacted by the macro environment, the other things that affect demand. But one thing that's interesting about Bitcoin is that with its fixed supply, supply changes don't affect the price. And that is one thing that contributes significantly to its volatility, right? With something like gold, you have, demand increases can raise the price, but then miners go out, they mine more gold, you have more supply, that, brings the price more to, it kind of levels the price. And that's, part of why the gold standard worked very well. And with dollars, if there's, central banks, they're tweaking supply, whatever, right, to kind of try to ensure price stability. But with Bitcoin, with the fixed supply, really the only thing that affects, the price is demand.
Yeah, and that is very different from central banks. Maybe we can zoom in on that a little bit because, we kind of take it for granted that we live in a world where central banks do play with the prices, play with the interest rates, and do all of the things that we're seeing now, right? But this hasn't been the way for, a very long time. So, Bitcoin, in a sense, like it's more of a free exchange. It's more of a kind of free market. Like maybe that's not the right term, but central banks are really, you know, kind of a central authority, right? That's controlling things. Central planners, financial central planners, and we looked at the fall of the Soviet Union, and it was like, okay, this model doesn't work. Let's move away from central planning, but yet we still have central banks. So, do you think that Bitcoin, as you were saying, the seeds were kind of planted in the late 80s and 90s? So, do you think that was also a kind of intuitive response to these people who were creating it, who were seeing that, central planning is not really going away in the financial arena?
Yeah. I think that Bitcoin offers an alternative to central banking. It's a monetary network that works, it self-governs, and it allows people to, do all of their transactions without relying on a central bank or the banks that work with the central bank, right? So it offers a complete alternative that works, that cannot be changed or altered by government officials.
Yeah. And, with central banks, I mean, we've seen that there tends to be, if you look at the big pattern, an inability to really control prices. And I guess that's because it's such a complex system. The market is so complex that central banks can never, of course, completely get it right. And, Hayek has spoken about this and many other Austrian economists. So can you maybe explain a little bit that philosophy and how it relates to Bitcoin?
Yeah. So Bitcoin is definitely influenced by Austrian economics, but with respect to central banking, central banks have this impossible task of ensuring, and I know that'll make a lot of economists really mad that I just said that it's like their job, that they'll never really succeed at their job. Because people have a lot of ideas about how central banks, if they just did this, then they would get it right? But they're always going to be influenced by politics. They always, have to, at the same time balance that with, this impossibility of, trying to capture all the information so that they can adjust the money supply to ensure price stability. And then, at the same time, central banking that is, discretionary, it's when it's really, they have the power to really do whatever they want with respect to the money supply, that's going to heavily politicize it. And that in and of itself makes it really challenging for them to actually do their jobs well.
Right. Like they're supposed to remain apolitical, but we've seen that they're not, you can always see that there are changes that are being made with election cycles, for example. You can also look at things like how now the Federal Reserve wants to start implementing climate change initiatives and things like that, right? So I don't know how that's related to central banking, but that seems to be a political thing.
Yeah. Simultaneously, as people have the options to kind of opt out of this centralized financial system with something like Bitcoin, centralized finance is becoming way more politicized. So it's kind of a funny thing that's occurring. And then, at the same time, I mean, you look at the U.S. The U.S. central bank is compared to global central banks, is even less politicized than some of the other central banks. But even then, it's not immune to political pressures, right? Like the Fed chair still has to get reappointed, right? So the process, the the Federal Reserve appointees, they go through, some of them have to go through, like the Senate, right? So it's a very political process.
Yeah, you can definitely see that the EU, they are far more overtly political.
Yeah, yeah,
And we're seeing that right now. Like the commissioner said the other day, Ursula von der Leyen, that we're going to have to flatten the curve on electricity. So
yeah,
they're starting to play with all of these other things and kind of play Sim City with people's lives. And
yeah.
if central banks go unfettered, they're able to do that. Whereas I guess with Bitcoin, it's just about exchange. It's just about money, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's a hilarious but also dangerous notion by that politicians are kind of embracing nowadays, that they can flatten every curve, right? Like it started with COVID. They were like, okay, we just need to stay inside for 15 days, then 30 days, then for the rest of your lives, and then you can flatten the curve. Nobody will be sick. And now energy prices are skyrocketing. Oh, we have to flatten that curve too, right? Like it's a very, very misguided hubris on the part of politicians that is quite dangerous. And then, you have Bitcoin as this alternative. Bitcoin is code, right? The rules are code. The governance process to change the code of Bitcoin, you have to submit a Bitcoin improvement proposal. It goes through an incredibly long process, and then it has to be accepted by everybody on the Bitcoin network. And so, changes to Bitcoin are incredibly slow. They're incredibly, kind of thought out, debated on. And actually, with Bitcoin, if we've seen changes or attempted changes to Bitcoin, like increasing the block size that eventually resulted in Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin kind of splitting. And, people chose Bitcoin because they like the monetary qualities of Bitcoin. And so you really have, with Bitcoin, you can choose kind of the monetary qualities of whichever network you want, I guess, if I'm putting that correctly. So
Yeah.
you really have choice with Bitcoin that you really don't have with your kind of government central banks, right? Like you don't have a choice of like which dollar you're going to use. And that's really tying that back to Austrian economics, one thing that Hayek really stressed the importance of was the denationalization of money. He saw that really a thing that has caused so much havoc and harm in people's lives is nationalized money, right? Like governments having total control of money and money coming from government and not people being able to choose what money they want. And that's what Bitcoin powerfully it gives people that choice, and it does so because it's censorship resistant, right? If governments could shut Bitcoin down, they would have done it 10 years ago, right? But they can't. So it gives people this kind of roundabout way, is the way Hayek posed it. He said, we won't ever really fix this until we create something that he basically said, we can't take the power of the control of our money back from governments. We have to just kind of create something else, really.
Cool. Yeah, an alternative.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, but skeptics would say that Bitcoin itself can't be controlled, but the platforms where you're able to access your Bitcoin can be controlled and shut down and regulated and banned. So what are your answers to that?
Yeah, so that is it's a challenge that Bitcoiners and Bitcoin advocates have to really take head on, right? So you saw with the truckers in Canada, one thing that is challenging for Bitcoin is that one of the main ways, because of convenience, that people buy Bitcoin is on exchanges that are regulated by government. And exchanges have a choke point where when you sign up for an exchange, you submit all your information to that exchange. So the government can know, oh, you've bought some Bitcoin, right? So they know you have Bitcoin, so they can, threaten, intimidate, censor, all of that, right? So even though you're holding a money that they can't, debase, change, take from you, they can make your life really hard. And that's a challenge that, especially in the West, people face, is that it's really hard to start a business, where you like sell people Bitcoin and do that without, it's legally impossible without to circumvent, the KYC process. So that's a choke point for financial privacy. And the alternatives to that right now are you can mine your own Bitcoin, and you can, send that to your own wallet. And, that Bitcoin is kind of non-KYC'd. It hasn't gone through the know your customer, anti-money laundering, rules and process where people have to give their information up. And then you could receive non-KYC Bitcoin peer-to-peer. Somebody could send it to you, or you could do something called coin mixing or a coin join, where you can kind of put your Bitcoin or another crypto asset through a process that tries to kind of scrub away the history of it, I guess, is a really, rough way of putting it. But, that process is not perfect. And it's also facing a lot of regulatory pressure to kind of crack down on coin mixers, which are really, it's really just a way to try to have financial privacy. It's not in and of itself, geared towards, crime or terrorism or something like that. Coin mixing is really just an attempt at financial privacy, but it's really been demonized by governments and regulators who say, we need the government to be able to see every transaction and everything that you do so that we can, stop criminals or something like that.
Right.
And it's not based on evidence, really. Like, you look at crypto crime statistics, and there's a lot more crime occurring with government money, and a lot more money laundering going on with government money than in, alternatives like Bitcoin. But, it's an excuse that they're using to basically keep up the war on financial privacy.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. I've seen the what is it, the BIF, or one of the big banks there, Kristina Georgievna, the Russian lady, who talks a lot about the CBDC. That's exactly the argument that she gives.
Yeah.
The IMF. She says, you know what? You're going to have all of these criminals who are using cryptocurrency. She won't even talk really about Bitcoin. She talked about it once, and that was it. It's kind of like the Lord Voldemort of the finance world. Nobody wants to name it who are in government or a big bank, because I think that they're threatened by it, right? So they tend to also put it in the same category as, failing kind of, for lack of a better term, shit coins, like Luna and things like that, and these kind of Ponzi schemes, and they put Bitcoin in the same basket as that. And then they say, well, yeah, there's going to be all kinds of criminal activity if we just allow this to go unfettered. So therefore, we are going to provide you with this CBDC, this central bank digital currency that will be coordinated globally among all the central banks, and once that's done, basically, don't worry, guys. There's a few problems. There's some human rights issues around this. And Georgievna has said this, actually. But don't worry, we're looking into it, and we'll make sure that everything is fine. But meanwhile, they'll be able to trace every single transaction, to know basically every move that you're making that's attached to your wallet, and surveil the population and everything that they're doing. So of course, Bitcoin having the potential to be the opposite of that is very threatening to that model.
Yeah. The IMF is, this might sound harsh, but the IMF is fundamentally a bully. The IMF really, lives on its ability to make people dependent on it, and force countries that are in dire financial straits to really operate like the IMF wants them to. And you have to do it our way or else you don't get our money, right? So if there's alternatives to the IMF, it's very threatening to them. And they're kind of, I don't even know if the IMF is like a nonprofit or something, I guess, but so I was going to say it threatens their business model, but I don't know if you can really call them a business, but they're a bully and they're kind of threatened by Bitcoin.
Yeah, that would make sense as well. There's also the Bank of International Settlements.
Yeah.
That big bank there. Like, do you know anything about the history of that bank?
Yeah, I mean the central bank, right? They influence how how other central banks should act and kind of give them the rule book, I guess. And they don't like Bitcoin, obviously.
Yeah. And interesting, I have this book, The Tower of Basel, because they're located in Basel, Switzerland, right? And it tells the history of the BIS. And I'm not quite into that book yet. It's just on my shelf. But I heard actually in a podcast, The Bitcoin Matrix, I heard an episode where somebody went through kind of the history of the BIS. So I can link that below for people to listen to.
Yeah, sure.
But what he says, the guest on the Bitcoin Matrix, was that the Bank of International Settlements was actually created to repay the war reparations from Germany from the First World War. And then after that, Hitler came in and he was like, we're not doing that. And then the BIS basically then became the place where all of the central banks would store their gold. And they became the main exchange for the central banks then. And it's taught that what happened then was that all of the Nazi war machine was basically funded by the BIS. And so it has a very dark history. Like they were supposed to remain neutral, but they actually enabled the Second World War to go on much longer.
Wow.
Yeah. And so it's kind of funny because it has those roots, that bank. And then you think about now how they're still at the top of the pyramid of the banks and that now they want to everybody to have this central bank digital currency, which will be all of the rules about it will basically be decided by the Bank of International Settlements, if I understand correctly. Like they seem to be really behind this. So that's really interesting for people to think about and consider. And like I said, it's just some small details about that. I would recommend listening to the podcast and reading the book to learn more fully about it. But isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that is. And it's interesting in the context of, the BIS continues to say that the future of money will be CBDCs, and that's because people have to trust central banks, and that the trusting your central bank means that you trust that your money will be fine and that you can use their money and that everything will be okay. And that's because people love central banks so much. And that's just, like flattening the curve, it's just insane hubris. And it's not the way it has to be, but they make it seem like it is.
Yeah, that's a really good point, David. So I actually want to talk though about where, Bitcoin has gone from, like I said, that kind of all-time high of around 69,000 now to around 20,000. People spoke about it being an inflation hedge, and so now anybody who may have been into it, maybe they're thinking otherwise, maybe they're worried about it, or people who were always skeptics or people who were really against Bitcoin now have this great argument to say, look, you guys were duped. Bitcoin is just another Ponzi scheme. And so there you are, there's the evidence. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah. So the inflation hedge narrative is funny because, it's pretty much promulgated by your typical like CNBC financial market commentator people, right? And the idea of an inflation hedge is something that protects you from the effects of your money having less purchasing power. And traditionally, people were taught that gold, real estate, stuff that's less tied to, the price is less affected by changes in money prices, were good inflation hedges. And then, because Bitcoin's supply can't be, diluted. Maybe people thought that Bitcoin was kind of like a digital gold. They kind of thought, oh, okay, well, Bitcoin is an inflation hedge, right? And then when the price of Bitcoin went down, oh my gosh, the inflation hedge narrative fell apart, right? But really, when you look at, kind of decoupling Bitcoin's price from, the qualities of Bitcoin, Bitcoin's price is pretty much traded, like a risky tech stock. Like and that's because, a lot of people, I think, kind of get into Bitcoin without fully understanding, what its monetary qualities are about, all this stuff. They just see like, okay, it's risky because its price goes up and down. It's new technology, right? So I'm going to put my money into Bitcoin. And then when the market starts to tumble, like we've seen over the past, this past year, Bitcoin also goes down because, all of a sudden those people go out, right? They're like, okay, I'm done with this speculative thing. I'm selling, right? Mm-hmm. So Bitcoin, Ether, all the cryptocurrencies have basically traded, more like with the stock market, right? And so the idea of the inflation hedge narrative, it has not really traded like an inflation hedge. However, a few kind of more comments on that. Really, the turning point will be when people are kind of stay in Bitcoin even when the market is in a downturn. And that's what's referred to as kind of like the decoupling of equities in Bitcoin. And actually today there was an article in Bloomberg about that, about how, there's so many people that are just holding, or in, Bitcoiners, they're called hodlers, are, holding their Bitcoin throughout this downturn. And that's what's caused the price to actually go up today while equities went down. So, if that happens, then Bitcoin could serve as an inflation hedge. But primarily what Bitcoin serves as is a monetary debasement hedge. And I say that, price can go up and down, but one thing that Bitcoin offers people, because its supply is not influenced by central banks, governments, whatever, the supply, it has a fixed schedule where 6.25 Bitcoin are issued roughly every 10 minutes until the next kind of halvening cycle, and that supply will be cut in half. Bitcoin is issued up until roughly 21 million, and then that's it. Those are the only Bitcoin that will ever exist, right? So when somebody buys Bitcoin, they buy it knowing that they're owning a scarce asset. They're putting their money or their value, whatever, into something that will never be arbitrarily printed, right? So when you're holding dollars, you don't know if the central bank's going to just, run the money printer on those dollars, right? Mm-hmm. But you know that Bitcoin, that's not going to happen with Bitcoin. And so it's really a monetary debasement hedge, and it might be an inflation hedge in the future, but it really hasn't served as one. And the idea of an inflation hedge is really, there are no sure inflation hedges, right? If there was a sure inflation hedge, that would be awesome. It would probably be, everybody would use it, right? But really, the idea of an inflation hedge is what people's best guess at an inflation hedge might be, right? So calling Bitcoin, saying it's failed because it hasn't served as an inflation hedge is really, it's very uncharitable at best. So
yeah, it's pretty myopic. It's really just focused on right now. Like, like I lost, whatever amount of money over the past few months and I'm just out of here, or just watching other people lose, but then you talk about hodling or holding, and so that's something that can maybe be like a long-term investment for people. And of course, the caveat, this is not any financial advice here, but just talking hypothetically. That's the kind of thing that, people who perhaps really understand the value of Bitcoin might be in that category. But this leads me to ask you a question that probably many people do have, people who aren't into Bitcoin, but maybe who are curious about it, is what is the intrinsic value of Bitcoin?
Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. Some people might disagree with that, but Bitcoin is money, and it has no other use other than its use as money, right? So when you have something like gold, might have what we would call an intrinsic value because it has a value for its use in something other than money, right? If we were using, this is just an example, but if we were using something like real estate as money, then that real estate would have an intrinsic value or something like that, like salt. If we were trading salt as money, salt has an intrinsic value because I can use it to season food, right? But Bitcoin has no intrinsic value because you can't use Bitcoin for anything other than money, right? And similarly with dollars have no intrinsic value unless maybe if there were a ton of dollars, I could use them to light the furnace in my house or something like that. But they really have no intrinsic value. So really, all Bitcoin offers people are its monetary qualities as money, and that's really why anybody, if they're really digging into it and not just, putting their money in Bitcoin because they're like, oh, this is a cool new shiny tech thing, maybe it'll go up, right? All it has to offer really are its monetary qualities. And those are that it is, it has a fixed supply schedule, anybody can use it, and it is decentralized, so you don't have to get permission from your bank or whatever to use it. And that's what makes Bitcoin attractive to people as a money, not that it has an intrinsic value like gold where you can use it as jewelry or salt or anything else.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation, actually. And then some people might say, well, then that's pointless. Like I don't want to use anything that doesn't really have any intrinsic value. But then they're using fiat money.
Yeah.
So, fiat money, of course, as you said, like the intrinsic value is just the paper that you could use if you wanted to burn it or to to start a fire in the apocalypse, or if you wanted to write down a note or something, but we don't actually even use cash money for that. So that's kind of a really interesting way of putting it. But maybe for some people they would say, but you know what, I'd rather stick with fiat money because it's more stable, because we can trust it, because all of the arguments that the central banks are giving, that we're trustworthy, et cetera. But then if you actually look at what central banks and the associated governments have been doing, in just the last 2.5 years, they've become increasingly authoritarian. They've become increasingly controlling. They have quashed down dissent. They have manipulated the money. And one of the things that we see in discussions about CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, which could be the alternative to the fiat money that we have now, and really the centralized kind of the flip side of Bitcoin. What we see there is the ability to manipulate money so that, for example, you're only able to spend a certain amount per month. You're only able to, if it's inflation, well, then they're going to adjust things within your own bank account, and your amount of money might fluctuate in there. And these are all things that are being spoken about. So it's not just hypothetical in that sense. These are really in kind of concrete discussions. And then there's also the ability to do things like China is doing, to attach that to your social credit and say, okay, well, you're not able to travel, if you haven't been a good citizen, if you've posted something on social media that we didn't like, right? And, there's all of those kinds of things that could happen with central bank digital currencies. And then if you look at where we're going in terms of the whole green movement,
Yeah.
This could very, very easily become something like, well, you know what, you've done enough mileage, for the month, so you're not able to buy any more gas or maybe you're not able to buy another vehicle for X amount of time. All of these constraints can be put on your money. So, maybe at this time, we don't see as much of a difference with Bitcoin in that sense. But when the time comes where those, possibilities become actuality, if that actually does get to that point in some countries, well, then it might be important to have an alternative, really.
Yeah, yeah, and that's an alternative. It is part of Bitcoin's monetary qualities, the permissionless transactions, but it's not like the fixed supply, the kind of monetary debasement hedge aspect of it. It's another aspect of it that's very important, and that's that Bitcoin enables people to be financially sovereign, and sovereign in a way where they have control of their money. It's not at the behest of central banks, and that's in the West, it's becoming increasingly important. Outside of the West, like you said, it's getting even crazier. So yeah, when you talk about when somebody says that Bitcoin is worthless and therefore the costs of mining are just 100% a net negative, it offers nothing of value. You hear these arguments in people that talk about the cost of Bitcoin mining. They think, the cost, it's harmful to the environment. It provides nothing of value because we already have money. And it's really important to ask those people, do we have good money? Do we have money that, enables us to be free? Or do we have money that is, increasingly threatens our sovereignty as individuals?
Yeah. And actually, on the energy point, I also heard an interesting discussion on that where the mining energy itself can be used to power other things. Have you heard that before?
Yeah. So Bitcoin mining it's really exciting because you can stick, a Bitcoin miner is it's just a computer. It's just a specialized computer that, it tries to solve the hash functions to compete at an opportunity of getting rewarded with the Bitcoin mining reward. Miners enter into pools to kind of increase that, their chances of it. And then there's also mining companies, but it's really just a bunch of computers. And if you think about the economics of Bitcoin mining, what are your costs? Your costs are just electricity, and you can put it anywhere. So it's powerful because you basically have an operation or a business where the costs are pretty much just the cost of electricity. So Bitcoin miners can move to anywhere that electricity is cheapest, and that empowers a lot of energy producers when they might have excess energy. Like in Texas, you have when shale gets burned, it just gets the excess energy just gets blown into the air. And that is, it's bad for the environment. Well, what if you can just stick a bunch of Bitcoin miners, attach those to the natural gas operation, and, you route that energy into those, and you have less flare going into the air, or just a host of different things that Bitcoin mining actually allows energy producers to do, and, just allows anybody to do if they want to make a business looking for the cheapest cost of electricity that they can, make a profit off of using to mine Bitcoin.
Yeah, so you can actually use the natural cycles and just kind of allow those things to have less waste, essentially. Yeah. But can Bitcoin itself, can the mining process itself also give out energy? Do you know?
I know that, yes. Yeah. So the mining, I don't know of how much. I mean, I've seen at-home miners where, these computers, they're running really fast. They get really hot, right? And so I've actually been in a warehouse of miners, or these computers, and it's really hot. It's a lot of hot air, right? So they do give off electricity, and I've seen some personal people that have, one or two of these machines, they're called ASICs, in their homes, and they've used them to like heat their pools or heat their homes or stuff like that. So there are uses for that as well. Not as like scalable as the energy required to, charge and use them, but they do emit energy as well.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of like cooking with a gas stove. Like you might have some residual heat that you can benefit from.
Yeah. And they also
Oh,
produce a lot of noise. So if you're looking at getting into it, it's you got to figure that out because they're loud. That's one of the main reasons I'm not running one in my apartment because it's very loud.
yeah. I've looked into that too, and that's what I saw also.
Yeah.
So that could be something that you want to put like in a shed or somewhere where you're not actually living, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of one of the downsides, I guess. But then again, that's maybe what adds to the kind of magic, in a way. Like there is a magical aspect to Bitcoin, and not to mean that it's not real, but that there's kind of some kind of allure that's really interesting about it, and that would be one of those kinds of things. Like you have to kind of mine it in a specific way. It's kind of mysterious. You gotta run these machines. They're gonna create heat. They're gonna create noise, and there's this real kind of process to it that's really different than printing money at a giant, central bank printing press, right?
Yeah.
It's its own kind of operation that's got its own flavor.
Yeah, and it's evolved because Bitcoin is so valuable. People value Bitcoin so much that they've basically worked to create these specialized computers that cost like $10,000 each one in order to be like the best computer for mining Bitcoin. I mean, when Bitcoin first came out, you could just mine it on your laptop. That I wish I was into it then, right? But it's really, the fact that people value it so much has generated an entire industry devoted to mining it, similarly to how gold did.
Yeah. And that's okay. So this brings me to the gold comparison. So you were saying earlier that, people do compare it to gold, but you don't seem to compare it to gold. Is that accurate?
Well, it's comparable. I kind of think about it in terms of, a new monetary technology that builds on some features that gold had, or has some features that gold had, but also builds on them a little, or builds on it a little bit. Similarly, kind of like in the evolution of different types of money, you had seashells, beads, silver, whatever, gold, then gold kind of won. And, then you had dollars, bad, right? And now we have Bitcoin, right? In terms of, technological properties. And so Bitcoin is like gold in that it's more scarce than dollars, and that, it's a way you can store your wealth in gold and be confident that the government's not going to print more gold, right? And so those are some powerful similarities between the two. But Bitcoin improves upon gold in that it's very easy to transfer value across space with Bitcoin. Very hard to transfer value across space with gold, right?
Yes.
It's very hard for me to mail you a gold brick, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with gold, you can, store your value across time, knowing that it's not going to be, debased or diluted or whatever, or that it's less likely to be. But, and you can do the same thing with Bitcoin, but it's really transferring value across space where Bitcoin improves upon gold. And then also the fact that Bitcoin is, the Bitcoin network is decentralized and largely immutable in that, like, you can't change Bitcoin, right? Is actually in the modern day, an advantage it has to gold because, gold is awesome, but it can be basically, governments can collect all the gold, right? And
Yes.
and it's easier to censor gold transactions, even though it's harder than with, digital fiat currency. it's easier for governments to kind of censor gold. And it's really one way that gold kind of failed, in that, in 1933, the reason AIER was founded, governments just said, no more gold. We're going to confiscate it all, right?
Executive order by FDR, right?
Yeah. It would be a lot more challenging for governments to confiscate all the Bitcoin. So Bitcoin's monetary qualities improve upon gold's in a few ways, and then also, many people consider scarcity to be important with money, and Bitcoin is more scarce than gold. Gold is, the supply grows around 2% roughly annually because, miners are mining it, right? But Bitcoin's supply is actually fixed, right? There will only be approximately 21 million Bitcoin in the world. So if you value scarcity with your money, Bitcoin is more scarce than gold.
And why could or should people value scarcity?
Yeah, I think that, over time we've seen that people like to store their wealth in scarce assets. That's something that, value is subjective, but, it would be, I would rather have, it's probably better to have a money that, if say you and I, and say there was a small town, we were like on an island or something. We had 100 units of money, and we were trading with that money. And because there were only 100 units, every time we produced more like capital goods, right? We got more productive. The purchasing power of those units increased, right? Along with kind of, society getting more productive.
Yes.
And then when you jack those units up to 200, right? From 100 to 200, then, our purchasing power, the purchasing power of each unit goes down, right? And so, having a scarce money kind of allows us to store our wealth in something that is, kind of allows that asset to grow as we grow more productive. And, the purchasing power of that asset can't be diluted by supply increases, is a roundabout way of explaining it.
That's a great explanation, actually. And so it's kind of like, growing in conjunction with the social process and the technological process, and how, how exchanges are actually happening with people. And rather than being something that you can manipulate, and we see that now when we're looking at inflation, when we're looking at, what caused inflation, when we're looking at also the supply issues, when we're looking at the money printing, when we're looking at all of these other factors that don't have to do with really the actual productivity and growth and technological advancements that, that we've been making as citizens, right? It's just kind of, you could see that there's a disconnect, is what I mean to say, between the fiat currency and between how people are living and how they're producing and consuming.
Yeah. And it's really intuitive. Like the example I just gave, I could probably give to a 5-year-old, right? And then you ask that same 5-year-old is probably wondering, well, wait, why do things just keep getting more expensive, right? And then you have to explain central banking and inflation to them and why people say that that's good, right? And it's just, it gets crazy, right?
Yeah.
And it's a sad thing, basically.
Yeah, they would probably not. They would say, "Well, that doesn't make sense." That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and you're like, "Well, it's a tough world, 5-year-old, right?"
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, so then Bitcoin, I guess, could be something for people. If they think that it's a good thing for them, that can give them some hope. That even if now, in the shorter term, it's dropped quite a bit. And maybe people have lost money, or they've just watched it happen. They could still think of what life might look like down the line, because I think that the overarching story here is that we're once again, almost 100 years later from the last big, waves of authoritarianism, we're in this kind of battle between very centralized power,
Yeah.
And decentralization, which is kind of like they're both reacting to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe like the growing authoritarianism is a reaction to increasing decentralization. Like the internet, people being able to look things up for themselves, people being able to look up medical treatments and alternative medicines, and to be able to choose what they want to watch, not just on network television, but on YouTube and things like that. Like we've seen trends of decentralization that have been happening in parallel with Bitcoin, really. And it's almost as if this authoritarianism that has grown has maybe been a reaction to that, and vice versa. So there are both of these forces that are working, against each other and with each other.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing I'd like to respond to initially, again, not financial advice, right? We're really this is a research institute. But if you kind of zoom out on Bitcoin and compare it to things, after the dot-com bubble, Amazon had like a 95% drawdown in a very short period of time, right? So, I think in today's world, where everything is like so headline driven, so kind of, narrative driven, you have like, it's really easy to say like, oh, it's decreased by X amount in X amount of time. It's dead, right? The funniest thing to me is, look up like Bitcoin is dead. It's like every other month, a kind of pro fiat journalist is claiming that, right? And, so I think that if you have conviction in Bitcoin or believe that it's kind of a hopeful thing based on its monetary qualities, then, zooming out might be helpful for you, at least psychologically. But yeah, it's technology has been interesting because, a lot of liberty-focused people thought that the internet would bring this beautiful new world where everybody could interact and be free of government and all of that. And we've seen that, government just embedded itself in the internet and started censoring stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Bad. Total, like, we were like, oh man, we got it wrong, right? But then, simultaneously, stuff like Bitcoin and, other, more privacy-focused things do offer hope. And I like the way that you put that like it probably would have been nice in the 30s if people had something like Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think so too. And I wonder, what did the struggle look like, with people who did not want to give up the gold standard, who did not want to have their gold confiscated, who, didn't think that the central banks should be doing that. And I think the central banks, the Federal Reserve was only created, like 15 or 20 years before that happened. So that's kind of interesting too to think about, is that there you have that kind of move on the chessboard, like boom, here's a central bank.
Yeah.
And then you have, okay, we're going to do this now. And, the mandates keep changing. Or the mandates have stayed the same, but the goalposts are changing in a sense, right? Like the Federal Reserve is supposed to be there for stability and for employment, correct? Yeah,
price stability, and then second, or I don't know if it's kind of ranked in order, but usually people say price stability matters more than maximizing employment. But yeah, that is the dual mandate.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. I've always thought that it's a bit of a conflicting mandate because, sometimes in order to have price stability, if you're manipulating money, you might end up in a recession. No matter how you want to define a recession, you might end up there.
Yeah.
And, what happens there is that you have employment instability. So they're kind of like these two things that are really difficult to juggle. They're they can be opposite at times, right? So if
Yeah.
things are going well, then there's jobs and prices are stable and everything is good. But when things start to get off track, when all of the things that have been done in the last 2.5 years, like printing so much money, just these lockdowns, stopping all these supply chains, like creating all of these interferences in markets worldwide and in exchanges and all of that kind of thing, then of course it's going to be really difficult for basically, I'll just say my opinion, in a way, central banks, they're kind of technocratic, right? Like they need to take all of the information and try and calculate everything and do it from this central place. But, we know that that's not maybe the best way of doing things. So I wonder, like, if there's actually a world where central banks can exist in conjunction with freer markets and in conjunction with Bitcoin, and that there can kind of be this symbiosis and everything can be kind of fine and things can kind of work out if there's, less intervention there. But I don't know.
Yeah. I'm really not sure because Bitcoin, Bitcoin offers, well, if it were easier to transact with Bitcoin, in somewhere like the United States, if laws made it easier, because one thing that makes it very challenging to transact with Bitcoin in somewhere like the United States is that every time you buy something with Bitcoin, it's a taxable event. So you have to record it, right, and pay taxes on it, and on it, the gain or the loss or something like that. So that makes it really cumbersome. And basically, it's on entrepreneurs to find a way around that, or not like help people do tax evasion, but find a way to circumvent that process so it's not a taxable event. Because Bitcoin is a money, right? It's not something. It's not really like a speculative thing that people are just putting money in like as an investment. It is a money. It's an attempt at creating a digital cash, and so
right.
It's Bitcoin. The Bitcoin network, though, really offers everything that the central banking institution also offers. So if Bitcoin works, if people start using Bitcoin for everything, it basically obsoletes the central bank. So it would be hard to see how that would exist in tandem for a long time if a lot of people start using Bitcoin, because then they're not using dollars, they're on the Bitcoin system, right?
Yeah.
I guess a central bank. So one thing that we had in the past were dollars or notes backed by gold, right? And that was because it's hard, like we were talking about earlier. It's hard for me to send you a gold brick, right? So we use like paper and stuff like that. But with Bitcoin, it's super easy, right? So there's no need really for unless you were to create an asset or like a second layer to try to like reduce volatility or something. There's no need for circulating notes backed by Bitcoin. You can just use Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, Bitcoin really threatens central banks. And you could still have, you could still collect taxes, do all sorts of that stuff, but a central bank controlling the money supply, if everybody's using Bitcoin, impossible, unless they can somehow control Bitcoin, which is impossible. So,
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. Or maybe another thing to think about is that maybe central banks could be like an alternative for people. Like maybe people say, you know what? I'll never want to be in Bitcoin. I never want to touch that. I'm not interested. And, it just offers a choice for people. And maybe that's what we'll see happen. Maybe central banks will start their own digital currency. That's where they're headed. Maybe they'll do this kind of thing, and then other people will stay over here. And then maybe over time that will change and we'll kind of see how things shift. Which brings me to kind of, I guess, maybe my last question for you today. This has been a wonderful discussion. I was thinking, like, what do you think is the future of Bitcoin? If I give you a crystal ball and I say, David, look into this crystal ball, tell me what you see, like shake it up, and what does it say? What are the options there?
Yeah, so I think that, there are a lot of different routes that, that could happen. That's really one thing that's important to remember is that, Bitcoin exists. Anybody can use it. Anybody can transfer value across space and time on the Bitcoin network, but it's still not, super easy to use Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis for all your transactions. And part of that is regulatory, but it's also on entrepreneurs to build the future of finance on Bitcoin if they want to, right? So it's really dependent on entrepreneurs. I think that Bitcoin builds upon a lot of gold's qualities and is a better kind of alternative to gold. People will probably still use gold because it's been around for 5,000 years. It's, gold is so important in terms of monetary history. But you could see Bitcoin maybe, assuming a lot of gold's roles at kind of the most bearish case I can give on Bitcoin, caveating that I really believe in the future of the technology. The most bearish case is maybe it replaces gold or some functions of gold. And, gold's market cap is around $10 trillion. Bitcoin's is, I don't know what it is today, but maybe it's in the hundreds of billions. It hit $1 trillion very briefly, but, that's at least 10 times smaller than gold. So you could see it kind of eat into that. And then, best case scenario, say my call to action to the entrepreneurs worked, and we build the future of finance on Bitcoin, make it easier for people to use. Then Bitcoin is the future of finance. And so that's kind of, those are the scenarios. Or, all sorts of things could happen. But I think that it's kind of like the internet in a way that it can't really be stopped. The process of creative destruction, the process of economic progress is a paradox. It's messy. Some stuff gets left behind. Some stuff, goes forward, and it'll be a mess. It'll be a very messy process. But I'm optimistic.
Awesome. Well, you know what? I think that this is a great place to leave our chat. It's been really, really lovely. I could talk about this for hours with you.
I know. Yeah, we didn't even talk about Luna, but it's okay.
Yeah. I guess Luna, people can look it up. Just check those headlines. Luna was, if you want to say a second about Luna, go for it.
Yeah, sure. I'll just briefly summarize that, a lot of crypto projects get created and, it's all of a sudden going to be the greatest thing. It's going to obsolete Bitcoin. And then it turns out to be a Ponzi scheme. And then the financial press somehow blames Bitcoin for it. That's really what we see. Or they're like, oh, crypto is toast and therefore Bitcoin is bad. When really Bitcoin had nothing to do with, basically this sketchy scheme to try to, Luna was basically, or UST, Terra, was basically monetary alchemy. A guy, tried to create the value of $1, an algorithmic stablecoin, but backing it with nothing, similar to how currency pegs basically break. And it broke. It cost investors or people that bought it, millions. I think it was actually the same as like the Madoff scandal in terms of like losses. And, it's important to separate stuff like that, which is basically an entrepreneurial scheme to create a crypto to enrich the creator, versus Bitcoin, which is money that was released to the world for basically everybody to use and doesn't have like this controlling entity that needs to make a buck off of it.
Yeah, so these other cryptos, how they're being compared, it's just a false equivalency.
Yeah.
But to your last point, I think that this is actually one of the things that could make people skeptic, is that, who would do this? What benevolent, people would decide to just gift the world? If everything that you say is true about Bitcoin, who would gift it to the world? Are there actually people out there who exist who just want to put something good into the world for people to use? The cynics might have a problem with that.
Yeah, I think that I would, this might sound hyperbolic, but I would point to the American founding. And I would say, did those people just, want to create a better world, or were they like self-interested, right? Were they, sometimes people can be altruistic and try to make a world a better place in the face of like something they perceive to be really threatening to the future of humanity. And similarly to George Washington, who, he was president, he helped America kind of get going, and then he stepped back, right? That's basically what the Satoshi Nakamoto did. So, if you're criticizing that, you're kind of criticizing this is very hyperbolic, but you're kind of criticizing the motivation of the America's founders. So.
No, I think that that's actually such a great example. And I'm glad that you brought up as well, altruistic and self-interested. Sometimes altruistic ends come from self-interested means.
Yeah.
So maybe this is what we're seeing here. Awesome. Well, listen, let's wrap this up here. It's been a great chat. Thank you so much, David. And I hope to have you on again to talk about more of this
we
stuff.
could go more in depth on all sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah, will be awesome. Thank you so much.